Welcome to the show, John. I'm very excited to have you on. Thanks for coming on tonight.
It's great to be with you, Adam. I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, there's so many things I want to ask you because each week on my show we're constantly talking about all the different issues that are raised in your books and when you speak publicly. So let me first start. You're known as the economic hitman. Your book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, is just mind-blowing. So let me start off with just by asking you, what exactly is an economic hitman? Explain that to us.
Well, I think it's fair, Adam, to say that economic hitmen have created the world's first truly global empire, and it's not an American empire. It's not a national empire. It's a corporate empire, and we do this in many ways. But perhaps the most generic, the most typical way is that we would identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil. Arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations, and yet the money would never actually go to the country. Instead, it would go to our own corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants, industrial parks, highways, things that benefit our corporations most, and secondly, they do benefit some of the wealthiest families in the country, but they don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or cars to drive on highways, or they can't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people. And yet the people of the country are left holding a huge debt they can't repay. So at some point, the economic hitmen go back in. We go in and we say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, sell your resource, your oil or whatever it is, real cheap to our corporations without any environmental restrictions or social regulations, or let us build a military base on your soil, all kinds of different conditions that we set up that really feed into the hands of the big corporations. One of the things we tell them to do is, hey, give all your social, your government resources, what's considered public, what was considered previous to this public property, like public utility companies, water and sewer companies, electric companies, schools, prisons. Give these or sell them at a very low price to our corporations. And in this way, we've really created this corporate monopoly around the globe. In the few cases where economic hitmen don't succeed, and I mentioned a couple of cases where I failed in Ecuador and in Panama, the Jackals go in. And these are people who either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. And in fact, when I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and the president of Panama, Omar Torrijos, when I couldn't corrupt them, I couldn't get them to accept these deals, both of them were assassinated.
Now, tell us who these jackals actually work for. Do they work for the corporations? Do they work for a particular government, like the U.S. government? They're part of the CIA or some covert organization we don't even know about. Who are the jackals? Where do they come from?
Well, in general, they're trained either by our military or the CIA, and they usually report to these people on one level or another, sometimes very unofficially. A lot of them are considered to be mercenaries, and then sometimes the CIA gets directly involved, as recently with the overthrow of President Zelaya of Honduras. The CIA was directly involved in that, and was directly involved in the overthrow in the 70s of Allende in Chile, in Diem in Vietnam, in Mossadegh in Iran. So it takes many different forms depending on the exact situation where they come from. But they're sanctioned almost always by some branch or other of the U.S. government, some clandestine branch. And I think it's important. It's a very important question, actually, Adam, because I think most Americans don't realize that our secret services, our CIA, our NSA, et cetera, and to a large degree our Pentagon and our embassies are really tools of big corporations. They serve the big corporations. They're not serving you and me. They're not serving the public. They're serving the big corporations. And that's why I say this is a corporate empire.
Well, each week on my show, one of the central themes is it's really a 1% of 1% elite, these rich families that really control the world through their resources and economics, and basically the 99.9% of us left really fighting and trying to survive day to day in the society that they set up. And it sounds like what you're telling us is when the economic hitman such as yourself being a part of that in the past, can't get it done for these families and these elite corporations that are out there, and then the Jackals go in to do what you guys can't accomplish. But basically, these small families and these corps are running the world. Is that it pretty much in a nutshell?
Absolutely. That's totally it. And I think the very fact that people know, that presidents, world leaders know about this system means that the economic hitmen usually succeed. So, for example, about 3 years ago, the democratically elected president of Honduras was overthrown in a CIA operative coup. And that was because he stood up against Chiquita and Dole and Russell Athletic and several other big U.S. corporations that were really exploiting the labor populations of Honduras and also the land populations. He was overthrown, replaced by a very brutal dictator who's running the country with an iron fist and very, very brutally. And that served notice throughout Latin America and in fact throughout the world to other leaders that might be tempted to stand up to big corporations, not to. In fact, the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who had taken a very strong stance against oil companies, immediately softened his stance, and we see that happening across the globe. So when one of these coups happens or an assassination happens, it sends a very strong message to everyone else. So the fact of the matter is economic hitmen usually are successful.
Well, based on what you just told us, you're talking about major United States corporations that you're saying are behind, like this last coup you talked about. Since they're United States based, you would have to assume that the government is behind this to some degree, or portions or segments of the government is also involved in this to get some advantage or some gain. So explain that a little more to us and what the gain was in particular, say, in this circumstance.
Well, there's no question that the United States government has participated very strongly in many of these, and in fact has admitted to a lot of them. Henry Kissinger admitted to his involvement and the State Department's involvement and the CIA's involvement in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran and Allende in Cuba, in Chile. So really these branches of the U.S. government serve the corporations. And let's remember, Adam, that the heads of most of our major government establishments, including the CIA and the State Department, usually come out of the corporate world. There's a very, very close tie. And or once they leave those jobs in government, they expect to get very, very lucrative jobs as consultants or lobbyists or heads of corporations. So there's an incredibly corrupt system at the very top of our government. It's incredibly corrupt. We don't have this kind of small corruption that so many countries have, where you got to pay someone in order to get your mail or to get some service like that done. We don't do that in the United States, but we have corruption on an extremely large scale that's quite legal. This revolving door at the top levels of government and corporations is outrageously corrupt and totally legal.
Well, it should be quite apparent to everybody by now out there that our elected officials aren't really elected officials, and they're not certainly there to serve the people. I mean, it's a sham right now, any difference between Republicans, Tea Party people, Democrats, conservative liberals. It doesn't matter who you put in office, it seems. The same politics as usual goes on, which, really supports what you're saying, because what goes on around the world just seems to really still support and promote and advance this 1% of the 1% rich families and corps out there. So with that said, how does everything you're talking about, the Jackals out there doing the job, the Hitmen doing the job, are you guys really indirectly just agents for what's going on with the people who run the World Bank and the Fed Reserve and the families behind that?
Yes, exactly. That's what I'm saying, is that this is a new kind of empire. There's not one emperor. There's a group of people, and I call them the corporatocracy, who head up our biggest corporations, and they're calling the shots around the world. And this is not.
Who are we talking about? Let's hear some names. What are the names of these families or these people? So people know, and they can Google them and see who these people are that are really the puppeteers pulling the strings behind the curtain.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. This is not a conspiracy theorist point of view. I don't. A lot of these people don't even know each other. They don't get together and conspire to do these things. But they're all driven by one motive, which is to maximize profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And they'll all come together when Congress or somebody else comes along and tries to pass a law that gets in the way. So these are the heads of all the major multinational corporations. I mean, you can name any major international corporation is part of this system. If they're using resources from other countries, the oil companies, if they're using labor, like the big retail establishments, like the Nikes and Reeboks and people like that, they are all part of this system, and they're all driving the system very, very hard. And if one of them gets into trouble in another country, if a country tries to clamp down on them, like Honduras recently did with land reform, and that had a big impact on the big agribusinesses there, Dole and Chiquita, and also by wanting to increase the minimum wage by 60%, which would have a big impact on the companies that use clothes that are made in sweatshops there, like Russell Athletic, then these companies all come together and insist that the United States do something, in this case overthrow, well, first of all, the economic hitman went in and tried to convince Zelaya to change his policies. He refused. He wouldn't do it. So the next step is overthrow him.
So we're talking about an assassination and then a new government put in place that's favorable to what these controlling groups or corporations want done. That's pretty much it, right?
In the case of Honduras, they didn't actually assassinate him. They took him out of the country and sent him to another country and wouldn't let him back in, and replaced him with another government. So
we're seeing this all around the world, though. I mean, like, is what happened in Libya and what we're seeing upcoming in Syria, are these all other examples of the corporate powers that be going in and trying to change things the way they want them?
Yes, but these are, and you mentioned Libya, you mentioned Syria, Iraq. These are cases where not only have the economic hitmen failed, but also the Jackals failed. They could not overthrow Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Assad, and they couldn't assassinate him. The security was too good in these cases. So in the cases where the Jackals also failed, then we send in the military. So it's really a three-stage approach. The economic hitmen first, and that's usually successful. When that's not, then the Jackals go in, and they're usually successful. But in the cases where they can't succeed, then the military comes in. And it's all to back up big corporations. It's not about you or me. It's not about a war on terrorism. I mean, look, who amongst us really feels threatened by terrorists? I mean, do you see one lurking behind every lamppost out there?
Right. Right. It's just very true. And it's like, so explain to us so people understand, what was the reason that we went into Libya and Arafat was actually assassinated, or Gaddafi rather, and same thing with what's going on in Syria, and why we really went after Saddam Hussein in Iraq? What were the real motivating factors behind these three situations?
Well, those are three very, very different situations. The one that, and I can comment on all of them, but perhaps the biggest one was Iraq, and the reason that happened was because I was very much involved with a deal we struck with Saudi Arabia back in the 70s after the oil embargo, where we convinced the Saudis that they would have to sell oil only in U.S. dollars, which put the dollar, we'd gone off the gold standard, suddenly put the dollar on the oil standard, and that they would reinvest their petrodollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. The interest from those Treasury bonds, which amounted to trillions of dollars over the years, would be used by the Treasury Department to hire U.S. corporations to westernize Saudi Arabia, build big oil refineries, desalination plants, in fact, huge cities out of the desert, which we did. So we struck this deal with the House of Saud, the royal family, and of course, part of the deal was that we would keep the House of Saud in power, which we did, and we struck a similar deal with Kuwait, which is one of the reasons that we defended Kuwait during the first Desert Storm procedure. After the House of Saud, Saudi Arabia accepted this deal, then we went after Gaddafi and went after Saddam Hussein and wanted him to accept a similar deal. He was the second most powerful oil producer at that time. We wanted him to accept a similar deal. He wouldn't. And so we sent in the Jackals. They couldn't take him out because his security was too good, and he had a lot of look-alike doubles. It's hard to take out a man like that. And so we sent in the military, the first Bush presidency, and figured that once we destroyed his military, we figured he'd been chastised enough that he'd come around, but he didn't. And we kept trying to bring him around, but in the end he wouldn't come around, so the second Bush invasion took him out. So that was a very, very classic case. If you want me to go on, I don't
Yeah, sure. I'd like to move on to Libya because for the same reason, their government was going to be switching to their own gold standard, and again, that didn't fit in line to what these corporate powers that be wanted, and they went in there really for that. Explain that to my audience.
Yeah, you bring up another very interesting point, because that also is what Saddam Hussein had decided to open an oil bourse, and the Iranians also did this, which meant that they would sell oil on the open market for things other than dollars, for yen or euros or something other than the dollar. We hate that. Gaddafi threatened to do the same thing. And in addition to that, of course, Gaddafi was very much supported by the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, his funds dried up, and that's when he admitted to Lockerbie, to the bombing of the Pan Am plane, and his and the Libyans' involvement in that. He came around to our side. The British and the U.S. Struck some oil deals with him. The French were incensed by this because they were left out of the deal. Sarkozy in France was very upset about this. At the same time, there was a rebellion against Gaddafi amongst tribal groups from Tunisia and parts of Libya. And the United States then started, and France supported these rebel groups. The United States was taking a lot of heat because for years we had condemned Gaddafi, said he was a bad guy, blah, 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 blah. And then suddenly, after he admits to bombing a Pan Am plane, we become his friends because we're taking oil from him. But the French now are making a big deal out of this. And so the United States and Britain both were shamed into then siding with the French and the rebels and taking Gaddafi out. We had almost no choice, and we could see that, in fact, probably the rebels and the French were going to win, and we wanted to have access to that oil, so we wanted to go in on the side of the winners.
Well, it's very obvious why so much of this military action overseas is taking place. And for anyone out there that thinks it's relating to terrorism or freedom fighting or any of that, they got their head buried in the sand, because it's nothing to do with that. It's always about money and everything else. I mean, the industrial military complex is stronger than ever. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And you know what, Adam? There's really no such thing as global terrorism. There are global acts of terror. But an ism is something that has a common set of principles. Catholicism, capitalism, socialism, those are isms. But, you know, the members of FARC in Colombia, I've interviewed them, and there's some Somali pirates and members of Al-Qaeda and Taliban. I've talked to all these people. They do not have a common set of principles. They're not connected by any principle other than a hatred for the corporations, for what's going on, and amongst their grassroots people, a tremendous sense of desperation and injustice. And then most of them are led by often wealthy fanatics like Osama bin Laden. But people like bin Laden would not get a following if there weren't such desperate, angry, suffering people around the world. So there are acts of terror. But there's no global terrorism. If we really wanted to get rid of these acts of terror, what we would do is if we go in and help some of these angry people become less angry, give them more access to resources, to jobs, and to the lands that our oil companies and our big hydroelectric plants and things like that have destroyed their lands, destroyed the fishing waters of the people we call now the Somali pirates, who were just fishermen trying to make a living, and their fishing grounds were totally demolished by international fleets and by our own naval operations in the area. So, you know, this idea of global terrorism is just a red herring that gives us an excuse to go out and attack people and build up a greater military, which is part of our economic base, let's face it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because you make some very eloquent and very insightful points on what you call a death economy versus a life economy. Could you explain what each of those are to my listeners?
Yeah, I think this is the key, Adam. I'm very hopeful. I know we can turn this thing around, and I want to just say that One of the reasons that I'm hopeful is because this whole system is driven by big corporations. And yet the big corporations totally depend on us, you, me, your listeners, to support them. And if we fully understand that we have a lot of power over them, the marketplace is a democracy if we choose to make it such. You know, we can have a tremendous influence on corporations by what we buy and what we don't buy, as long as we send a strong message. And we've been very successful at getting rid of things like apartheid in South Africa by boycotting the companies that supported it, cleaning up terribly polluted rivers in this country, getting corporations to open the doors wider to women and minorities. We're very successful when we launch these things. And right now, I think what we have to face is the fact that we have a failed global economic system. It's just not working. And one good symbol of the fact that it isn't working is that less than 5% of us live in the United States, and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world's living in destitution. That's not a model. China cannot repeat what we've done. They're trying to, but they can't do it. The numbers don't add up. Nor can India, nor Latin America, nor Africa. It's a failed system. We have to change it. And it's a system that's built on death, militarization to a very large degree, actually killing people, and also killing the planet, pillaging and raping and destroying our resources. And what I'm saying is we need to create a life economy. We can create a lot of jobs. We don't have to sacrifice jobs, but these jobs should go toward cleaning up the terrible pollution of this planet. Every place is polluted. The oceans are terribly polluted. The air, the land, polluted. And helping hungry people around the world feed themselves, grow food more efficiently, distribute it and store it more efficiently, come up with new technologies for transportation and communications and energy and banking and marketing, come up with new systems. There's a huge economy out there waiting to happen, a life economy, one that's based on making a better world for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren across the planet. And I'm very, very excited about these prospects, and I think I've been traveling all over the globe in the past year. I've been to practically every continent except Antarctica in this last year. And everywhere I go, I see that people really are waking up. They're getting it. You know, books like Confessions of an Economic Hitman are reaching the world. But it's not just. There's lots of books now and lots of people talking about this like you and movies and documentaries. The word is really getting out. I think we're in a consciousness revolution, and that's a darn good thing.
Well, what can people out there do to actively get involved to get this revolution going, aside from supporting people like you who have the courage to come forward and tell what really happened and support your books and listen to shows like this one? What can people actively do to help change from this death economy to a life economy that benefits everybody?
One of the most important things I think is to really work on changing this economy. You know, support organizations that are producing a life economy, and organize movements. Consumer movements are very, very powerful. You know, if you know, every one of your listeners would send an email to Nike and say, hey, you know, I like your products, but you get slaves working for you in sweatshops in Indonesia and other countries. I'm not going to buy any more Nike products until you pay those people a fair wage. If we do things like that, and for Monsanto, for Exxon, all these different companies, to really let them know that we're watching them, and we're only going to support the ones that are working to create a better world for ourselves and our children and grandchildren. They hear us. They have to hear us. Huge companies have failed in my lifetime. You know, we've seen mammoth companies go down because they didn't keep up with what people wanted, and they understand this. So the marketplace truly is a democracy, but we have to use it as such, and we've not been doing that.
People have to realize their voice means something, and when all those voices unite, it even has a much more powerful effect. I want to go to a live email question that I had as we're doing this. Someone just asked, please ask John to comment on this, because I had many guests in the past who commented on this point, and they'd like to hear your perspective. What happens to the corporate empire? They want to know if the corporate empire plans on crashing the dollar, or are they going to try to keep it a valid key to their success? So in other words, does the dollar need to stay as the main currency, or are they going to crash it at some point, maybe give a false flag or incident to crash it and move on to something else, to start maybe a global world economy or a global government? Like, what's your comments on that?
Well, I think, right, they want to keep the dollar strong. And it doesn't matter where you are. The Chinese want the dollar to be strong. Everybody does, because they're all owed a lot of money by us, for one thing. And I think it's interesting that the big corporations like the idea of the euro because they like a currency they can use in Europe, but they still want the dollar to be the basis for everything, especially for oil, because that sort of defines, that's like if these have the gold standard, now we have the oil standard. And it's been very interesting to watch what's gone on in Europe, where the corporatocracy supports the euro, but they don't really support a strong European Union. And they've been working to kind of break that up, because they like the fact that some countries can give them big tax breaks like Monaco, and other countries will have much more lenient labor policies, and other countries will have much more lenient environmental policies. So they want to keep those countries having differences. They don't want a standard set of principles that guides all the social and environmental policies across the board in Europe, but they do like the euro because it makes it easier for them to trade. Nonetheless, they want to keep the dollar strong.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask what must be on everybody's mind, and I know it certainly was on my mind when I found out I was going to be interviewing you after reading all the different information that you whistle-blew about, basically. Are you still in, or are you out as an economic hitman dealing with any of these people? Because to me it would seem like the mafia. You know so much of so many different inside things that have happened from the highest levels where the security clearance must be ungodly. How do you get to pull out? You watch a mafia movie, you're in, you're in. You know, they keep pulling me back. How are you out if you really are out?
Well, Adam, it's a good question. I tried to write the book Economic Hitman after I got out of the business back in the early 80s. I contacted other economic hitmen and Jackals to get their stories, and I was immediately called, anonymous phone calls threatening my life and my young daughter's life. She was born in 82. I took these threats seriously because I had seen what can be done. At the same time, I got an offer from the chairman of the board of Stone & Webster, a large consulting firm out of Boston and New York in those days. And he took me out to dinner one night, and he said, hey, you've got a great resume. And I did. My official title was chief economist of one of his rivals, Charles T. Main. I had 50 employees working for me at one point there. And he said, you have a great resume. We'd like to use your resume in proposals. You don't have to do any work for us at all. Just let us use your resume, and don't write that book that you're working on. And I'd like to offer you a $500,000 consultant's retainer. And so it was really a bribe, and it was totally legal. These things are done. I took the bribe. I didn't want my kid to be killed. I knew what the Jackals could do, and in my own defense, I'll say I didn't spend the money on a new car, or fancy house, or something. I invested it in working in Latin America, forming nonprofits. You can go to dreamchange.org and see one of the nonprofits I founded, or pachamama.org. Go to johnperkins.org and sign up for my my newsletter. So I invested the money in starting a whole new life of working in nonprofits in some of these places where I'd done so much damage. And I wrote 5 books on these countries, on indigenous people, not on economic hitmen, on things that did not bother Stone & Webster or these other people. But then my contract at Stone & Webster had run out. 9/11 happened. I was in the Amazon at the time. I flew up to New York right afterwards and went to Ground Zero. And as I stood there, I knew I had to write this book. I had to get this information out. But this time I decided I wouldn't tell a soul I was writing it. I would write it completely in secret. And rather than interviewing other people, I'd write it totally as my own personal confession. And when the manuscript was completed, I got it in the hands of a very good New York agent who got it out to all the major publishers. At that point, it became my best insurance policy, and it still is. The last thing anybody serious in this business wants to do is see me have an untimely death, a strange death, because that'll sell many, many millions more copies of the book, and that's the last thing they want. So my advice to any whistleblower is blow the whistle, but don't threaten to do it. Don't let anybody know you're going to do it ahead of time. Get all your ducks in order. Get the video out there or the book out there or whatever it is, and then it's your insurance policy, because the last thing they want is to turn you into a martyr or somebody whose picture's going to be splashed across the front pages of newspapers because you've been assassinated.
Is that the same advice you give right now to Edward Snowden, and why he's probably still around and not somewhere found in a ditch?
Yeah, he did it the right way, and Assange kind of did it the wrong way. That's why he's stuck basically in a broom closet in the Ecuadorian embassy in England. I think Snowden was pretty smart about the way he did it. He got it out there, and now he's apparently leading a pretty good life in Russia. Who knows exactly what's happening to him? But I don't think he's faring too badly, and he's still alive. They're both still alive.
And would you say people like that heroes or traitors?
Heroes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I agree. I just wanted to ask you to get your opinion. I knew what it was going to be. Listen, John Perkins, I greatly appreciate you being on. We only touched the surface. I have to get you back sometime in the future. Tons of great information, as always, tonight. I urge all my listeners to go out there and pick up his books and go to his website. And with that, many thanks. John Perkins, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Adam. It's been my pleasure. Keep up your good work. This is what's going to make us free.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.